Hello and welcome to the week 8 lecture on Text in Time and Text in Theory, which is about the 19th century and focusing specifically on Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, published in 1847. The lecture is in 3 parts. The first part will look at the biography of Emily Bronte and the novel called Wuthering Heights. Brief words on the publication history and the critical reaction that the novel received in its time. Then I'm going to say some words on what I've called the strangeness of Wuthering Heights, both in terms of its form, how it's put together, and of course its content. So that's the first part of the lecture. Then in part 2 of the lecture, we'll be thinking a bit more about strangeness in relation to a set of different contexts, both historical and cultural. And part 3, we'll be thinking a little bit about genre and gender politics, but I'll say more about parts 2 and 3 when we get to them. So Emily Bronte was born 30th of July 1818, the same year, coincidentally, that Frankenstein was published, Thornton West Riding in Yorkshire. She was the youngest of 5 siblings. Anne Bronte was born in 1820. Aged 17, she attended Roe Head Girls' School, but she became homesick and left after just a few months. In September 1838, she teaches at Law Hill School in Halifax, again returned home in April 1839, this time for health reasons. Wuthering Heights was published in 1847, December 1847. The author was the pseudonymous Ellis Bell, a not uncommon practice for female writers at the time, as I'm sure you're aware. Charlotte revealed the real author in 1850. That's Emily's sister Charlotte, author of Jane Eyre. Emily Bronte died young of TB on the 19th of December 1848. Wuthering Heights has a long history. There have been 11 film adaptations, plus numerous TV series, radios, 3 operas, musical theatre productions, and of course, a famous song by Kate Bush called Wuthering Heights. So the contemporary critical reaction. The first one from the Examiner, 8th of January 1848. This is a strange book. It is not without evidences of considerable power, but as a whole it is wild, confused, disjointed and improbable. And the people who make up the drama, which is tragic enough in its consequences, are savages ruder than those who lived before the days of Homer. Savages is a strong word, but the reviewer here is getting to one of the, I think, rather curious aspects of this novel, which is that very few characters in it are nice to any other characters in the novel. There's a lot of behaving quite badly in this novel, and often quite violently, and that's sometimes physical violence, but it's very often verbal and emotional violence. The second review from Douglas Gerald's weekly newspaper, 15th of Jan. In Wuthering Heights, the reader is shocked, disgusted, almost sickened by details of cruelty, inhumanity, and the most diabolical hate and vengeance, and anon come passages of powerful testimony to the supreme power of love, even over demons in the human form. The women in the book are of a strange, fiendish, angelic nature, tantalizing and terrible, and the men are indescribable out of the book itself. That last line, I think, suggesting that they are unbelievable. They may not pass muster in the real world. But interesting also that reference to fiendish angelic women. In some ways, that's a classic dichotomy between virgin figures and demons. But it's also shows awareness of the Gothic texture, the Gothic modality of this novel, which is very evident to all readers, and we'll come back to that in the final part of this lecture. Another contemporary review from Atlas 1848, a strange inartistic story with evidences in every chapter of a sort of rugged power. Its effect is inexpressibly painful, and it presents shocking pictures of the worst forms of humanity. So it's strange. I think we can agree that reviewers found it strange. I think the rugged power again, is interesting, and that may, of course, be an oblique reference to the rugged power of the landscape, which is very evident and very much a familiar and exciting part of what Wuthering Heights does, that location within that wild moorland landscape. So it's a strange novel. We might also say it's a transgressive novel. It transgresses several boundaries, really, to do with acceptable behavior, to do with romantic relationships. There are many examples in the novel that we might call transgressive, where boundaries are breached. And again, that's something we'll come back to. So the strangeness of Wuthering Heights, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list. You may have other things that you want to talk about when we get to seminars, but there are horrific events. There is a tempestuous love story between Catherine and Heathcliff. There are illicit liaisons. There is revenge, violence, attempted murder, abduction, forced marriage of a young woman. There is a long illness. There is a suicide, we think, as surely Heathcliff's death is. There are unanswered questions. Heathcliff's origins and ethnicity are alluded to with the various kind of slightly disparaging epithets that are applied to Heathcliff, but we're never quite sure. We don't know how he makes his money. He disappears at one point, comes back, and he is considerably wealthier. That is shrouded in mystery. There is the element of the supernatural, again expressive of the Gothic underpinning of this novel. The unquiet slumbers of the deceased, for example. The fact that ghosts do seem to be a thing in Wuthering Heights. People come back. There's the question of readerly identification. It's not a scholarly question, this, who do we like? Although obviously it's an important aspect for many readers when we're reading something. Do we actually like any of these people? And I have to say, I struggle. You may disagree. But from, housekeepers to children to Heathcliff, people don't behave well. They're not terribly likable. Again, we may disagree. We've also got the question of layers of narration. How objective or reliable is Nellie as a narrator, or indeed anybody else? We'll come back to that in the second lecture. As I've said to students on a number of occasions already this semester, I think, no narrator is reliable. Narrators give you what they want you to hear. So in that sense, they're always partial. They're always unreliable. But here, the many layers and the moments where people are explicitly deceiving others about who might be hiding and listening makes this a real kind of model of textual instability and unreliability, I think. Linguistic strangeness. Joseph's speech is rendered phonetically. Now, I'm not. I don't want to make any disparaging comments about Joseph's regional accent, but I think it is difficult for a contemporary reader, of course, and it was to reviewers at the time of publication. Now, that gives it, of course, that very localized flavour, and that's very important to the book. Transgression. It's a novel full of physical boundaries being transgressed. Doors, walls, windows, locks, and we have the name Lockwood, of course, enclosures, but they're constantly being breached by various characters. We have a love which defies social and cultural expectations, something of which Cathy is very aware in her comments on why she doesn't marry Heathcliff. And we'll look at those in a bit more detail in the workshop and the seminars. Transgressing the boundaries between what is considered socially acceptable and unacceptable. As I've said already a couple of times, people don't behave in, socially acceptable ways in this. There's a lot of abusive behavior. The transgressing of boundaries between people. Identity itself is unstable here when Cathy says, I am Heathcliff, on page 73 of the edition which is in the bibliography here. There's that blurring And that makes their romantic relationship even stranger and more intense, the sense that she has of merging identities with Heathcliff and inseparability. The boundary between the real and the supernatural is questionable here, as it is in the Gothic mode in very general terms. Lockwood sees the ghost of Cathy at the window, the famous scene that inspires Kate Bush's famous pop song. Hints of the we have to at least entertain the possibility that ghosts really do exist. And of course, ghosts can also be a realization or manifestation of memory and grief and trauma and all of those things. So therefore, we have potentially the transgression of the boundary between life and death. And there are perhaps no more fundamental transgression than that one. So Pauline Nestor, introduction to the Penguin edition that I'm quoting from here, she says this: this transgression of boundaries takes place in the novel on both literal and figurative levels. A number of critics have noted the novel's preoccupation with physical boundaries like walls, windows, gates, doorways, and locks. These boundaries are frequently guarded and just as frequently breached. So while one character after another seeks to control his world by locking others in or out, the novel documents the failure of every such attempt. So boundaries are set up, locks are turned, only to be breached and unlocked time and time again. And there are many, many implications to this breaching of boundaries, which we will get onto when we explore the context a bit further in this lecture. An example here from the novel. This time I remembered I was lying in the oak closet, and I heard distinctly the gusty wind and the driving of the snow. I must stop it, nevertheless, I muttered, knocking my knuckles through the glass and stretching an arm out to seize the importunate branch, instead of which my fingers closed on the fingers of a little ice-cold hand. The intense horror of nightmare came over me. I tried to draw back my arm, but the hand clung to it, and a most melancholy voice sobbed, "Let me in, let me in." "Who are you?" I asked, struggling meanwhile to disengage myself. "Catherine Linton," it replied shiveringly. Terror made me cruel, and finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist onto the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes, and still it wailed, "Let me in," etc. It's an extraordinary scene, absolutely extraordinary. The violence that is enacted upon Catherine's revenant returning form by Lockwood is quite extraordinary. Rubbing her hand across the broken glass, making it bleed. I mean, it's an incredible image. Soaking the bedclothes, very violent. So here we have the breaching of boundaries between life and death, but again between acceptable and deeply unacceptable forms of behavior. So that's just one very famous example of the kind of transgression that we see on a fairly regular basis in Wuthering Heights. James Kavanagh, in a book called simply Emily Bronte, says this: "From the outset, the text seems at once fascinated with rebellion and worried the disruption of the repressive mechanisms of culture will tend towards a mindless anarchy that would be unbearable in its own right." So Kavanagh is pointing towards perhaps a wider context here, or context, that he uses the term rebellion. And examples we've looked at already of breaching of boundaries might be seen in Kavanagh's terms as forms of rebellion. Rebellions against the expectations imposed upon characters by a rather repressive society, rebellions against gender expectations, rebellions against the way that class relations are supposed to be enacted. And we can think about that in the figures of Nellie and Joseph and the way they behave in relation to people of higher social classes. So we're going to pull a bit more on this thread in part two, the idea of rebellion, and think about this in relation to some specific contexts. So this is part two. You might want to pause proceedings here. Take a little break. I'm recording it in one go, but you know there are 3 distinct parts, so you're welcome to digest it in that way. So here we're going to think about contexts in relation to the strangeness we've already identified. We're going to think about the Enlightenment and Romanticism. We're going to think about rebellion and reform, empire, and we're going to touch on evolutionary theory and its challenge to religion as well. So some pretty big historical, cultural and intellectual context there to grapple with. So the Enlightenment, as you may be aware, is the so-called age of reason. This is a simplification of what it was, but it's a useful working term for what we're looking at here. Key figures in the Enlightenment included David Hume, Thomas Reid, Adam Smith, and Immanuel Kant. The first 3 associated very much with the Scottish Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant with the German Enlightenment, but they were, very much kind of parallel connected movements. Key works include Reid's Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense, Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature, and Smith, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. There was an emphasis here on exploring reason and individualism, the questioning of religious doctrine and tradition, and humanistic philosophical strands. It is an oversimplification to say that the Enlightenment was against religion, or was positing reason as the polar opposite of religion. It wasn't doing that at all, actually. There was plenty of religious thought and arguments about the existence of God, for example, going on at this time. A key strand here, and this is reflected in Smith's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. This is Smith, who became perhaps better known for his theories on economics. This idea of sympathy, feeling, social connections, and morality. The term sympathy used often in the 18th century Enlightenment in the way that we might understand empathy now, putting oneself in the shoes of another, trying to imagine and understand how another would feel, and by doing so, enabling meaningful social connections. So the idea that sympathy was one of the key structuring principles of a functioning society, as well as a basis for moral judgments. The question of common sense also was up for debate, the sense in which we could trust our senses to understand the nature of the world, which basically Thomas Reid was saying, and a more skeptical view as exemplified by David Hume. Try and put this simply, Reid would say, if a rose smells nice, I can be pretty sure that there is a property of the rose which can be called a nice odour. Hume's skeptical approach would say, just because when I smell the rose it smells nice doesn't mean I can say with much confidence that the rose has a nice smell. It's just that I perceive a nice smell. So he sees things through the prism of individual perception. Anyway, these are the kind of things that were being discussed. But this idea of sympathy, I think, is a very key idea coming out of the Enlightenment. Certain thinkers in the Enlightenment were worried about an excess of sympathy, people who put themselves in other people's position too much, who feel other people's emotions much too much. There was a novel published in the 18th century called The Man of Feeling, in which we have a character who is excessively sympathetic, to the extent where it actually kills him. The Romanticism, then, we might contrast this with the Enlightenment in its emphasis on imagination rather than reason. Nature, obviously very important to, let's think of famous romantic poets like Wordsworth and Keats. Nature imbued with something of the divine, and then an interest in humans' relationship with nature, which is central to much Romanticism. An individualistic strand, the individual communing with nature, for example, and the communing with the divine and experiencing the sublime. The Romantics might suggest that reason cannot explain everything. We need to give credence to feeling, imagination, the stirrings of the unconscious, an interest in beauty and the sublime. Remember Edmund Burke and the sublime, and the idea of looking at, for example, a mountain and feeling both its beauty and a kind of awe, even a kind of terror. This is something that we find throughout the book Frankenstein, for example. And we might see a connection there with the moors of Wuthering Heights, a sort of sublime landscape, both wildly beautiful and also in its own way awesome and terrifying. In the Romantics, we might also see a rejection of modern life, or at least a questioning of ideas of progress that are associated with the Enlightenment, and then, of course, with the Industrial Revolution, and the Gothic, a mode which is very much emerging as part of Romanticism. So this is the context, I think, where we might place Wuthering Heights as a kind of post-Enlightenment romantic text. Thinking back to Kavanagh's point about rebellion, there was an Electoral Reform Act, the first Reform Act in 1832. This is an important context as well, sort of democratizing movements that were happening in the early 19th century. We had nonconformists attacking the church's monopoly on power. We had Darwin working on evolutionary theory in this period, which was a challenge to a fully religious explanation of the world. We had important developments in the women's rights movements, the Seneca Falls Conference in the United States in 1848, and the Langham Place group, feminist group, from 1857. An example we get in the text early on, page 16 to 17, Catherine's writing in the margins, we see a kind of image there of a rebelliousnit's. And I've supplied here in very broad terms kind of things that were happening in the early 19th century as a context here. But it's one way of looking at Wuthering Heights as a transgressive, rebellious text, emerging out of social historical circumstances which were themselves challenging authority, challenging the old orthodoxies in terms of gender, electoral behaviour, and even, of course, how we got here, Darwin's evolutionary theory. There's also the context of empire, of course, in the 19th century. We might see the 19th century broadly as a high point of British Empire, but of course there were challenges within that. And from empire we get, of course, general challenges to power and hierarchy that we've already looked at, but we also get the kind of sense of otherness. British Empire's engagement with places like India and the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world. This strong idea of the ethnic, the racialized other is emerging from discourses of empire. That is often configured in terms that we would see as explicitly racist. Heathcliff, then, is a kind of hybrid character. He's a gentleman of some means, he returns with money, but he's referred to in many cases as a gypsy. So there is this sense in which he is ethnically and culturally othered. He has this connection with Liverpool, which of course was a major place for the slave trade. So Heathcliff is a good example of the kind of, empire, the figures who are othered within British Empire. Anxieties were emerging about Victorian British society as morally superior. There's a sense of empire and degradation and transgression again. Could it be seen to be this unequivocal good that it had been seen before? Heathcliff is a figure, I think, who provides this sense of imperial uncertainty. Nellie describes him as fit for a prince in disguise. Who knows but your father was Emperor of China and your mother an Indian queen, each of them able to buy up with 1 week's income Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange together. So that sense in which there's a kind of uncertainty about Heathcliff. His economic power tied to his ethnic difference makes him very much a kind of in-between hybrid figure. And of course, the way he is in the novel and his behaviour towards Cathy and other characters, is beginning to challenge what we might think of as an imperial dichotomy of the conqueror and the conquered. Thinking about colonial activity, we might also think of Wuthering Heights more obliquely as a book about the colonization of the mind, people getting inside other people's heads, the power of one ideology over another. And the power relationships we see in the novel, we might think about those in terms of imperial power. It's worth stressing that Emily Bronte may not have had this consciously on her mind when she was writing, but of course we see complex relationships between literary texts and their historical context, and the structure of feeling, as Raymond Williams calls it, of England at the time, would undoubtedly have had an effect on the way this novel was created. So Darwin is working on his theory of evolution post the Reform Act. We see it again as a challenge to traditional authority, the authority of the church, the authority of certain explanations of how we came to be here. So we can see the two things as related in that sense. It's a challenge to religious teaching. Again, we need to beware of simplifications about the 19th century. It simply is not the case that religion kind of disappeared. Oh, we've got evolution now. Let's ditch religion. Not the case at all. But certainly Darwin was seen as a challenge. This is also a theory focused on inherited characteristics and legacies. And this, I think, is a way that we can see some connections to Wuthering Heights, which is very much about legacy. It's about what children inherit from their parents. It's about cross-generational trauma. It's about how grief works its way into family cultures and family characteristics. So that sense of inheritance, not necessarily physical inheritance, although that's there, but psychological, emotional inheritance, I think is really important in Wuthering Heights. And we can see that in some ways as emerging from discourse of evolution. And of course, there's the question again, we've touched on this already in the lecture. Enlightenments and romantics, are we progressing, are we evolving, or are we actually seeing a kind of regression or devolution as we move through the 19th century? And people were divided. Is the Industrial Revolution an unequivocally good thing? For many people, absolutely not. It's a kind of regression, a move away from nature where we may find moral good and the divine. So moving on to part 3 of the lecture. Again, feel free to take a little pause at this point. Thinking more about the form of the book, the genre and its mode, the gender politics, some tentative conclusions, though they are very tentative. It's not a novel I'm going to arrogate to myself any firm conclusions about. It's too complex and too strange for that. But some ideas, more a kind of summary. So, needless to say, really, this is not Jane Austen, right? The manners on display here are wildly different to what we're seeing in Austen, and the kind of politeness, which of course in Austen masks a lot of impoliteness, completely dissipates here. So we're dealing with a domestic situations in the same way that we are with Austen, but in a very, very different mode here, not a comic mode at all. Victorian novels, we might argue, were characterized by realism, the real world, traditional ideas, manners, and sociality. But Bronte is doing something a bit different. Rebellious female characters living in a society that prevents her from marrying the man she loves, rebelling and transgressing. So this is fertile territory for an earlier mode, or a mode which emerged at an earlier time, the Gothic. So let's spend a bit of time thinking about that. Now, many of you on this module, of course, are also taking the Gothic Nightmares module, so some of what I'm about to say will be very familiar to you already. So we've got Anne Radcliffe in the late 18th century, The Mysteries of Udolpho, and Charlotte Smith, The Old Manor House, and then Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, 1818. So we've got some sort of key Gothic texts, which we might see as ancestors of Wuthering Heights, female-authored Gothics, all interested in the position of women within particular societies. Images of female entrapment and challenges to that. So we see that in Gothic texts, we see it in Wuthering Heights. People confined, people forced into marriages, different images of entrapment for women. The forces of patriarchy in the form of, well, Heathcliff, among others. We see challenges to traditional families. We see challenges to the idea of the functionality of families. We got, this is a very dysfunctional novel, in fact, in many ways, romantic relationships and familial relationships. We see women as educators and writers in these texts. These are forms of empowerment. And if we think of the final scenes of Wuthering Heights, where we see an image of the next generation with the female character teaching reading and writing to the male character, that's a form of empowerment and perhaps one of the sources of hope in a novel which is otherwise quite bleak. Houses, the importance of the house in the Gothic, the castle, then the house, often in a lonely, windswept place, exactly what we have in Wuthering Heights. So very much a Gothic kind of setting, and the weather reinforces that modality. Houses in these texts are both property, material property, and symbols. Symbols of family, symbols of legacy, symbols of many of the other things that we've talked about, perhaps, maybe symbols of empire. They function as metonymies, parts that represent the whole. So we might see them as houses as representing nations, or houses as representing empires. Many different ways that we can interpret the figure of the house. Obviously in the Gothic, the darkness, the brutality, and the extremes, I've already touched on these, in abundance in Wuthering Heights. The interest in the unconscious and what the unconscious might do despite the conscious ego. And ghosts, again, are a figure which we might associate with the unconscious, things that return despite ourselves. And also the interest in texts and textual authority. The Gothic as a mode is full of secret letters and diaries and journals and different layers of textuality, different narrative voices, different accounts of the same incidents. So it's always questioning that idea of textual authority. And we see that in Wuthering Heights, the different narrators that we have. So thinking about the gender politics, she does marry Edgar. She eschews fantasy and she acknowledges aspects of reality. And this is one of the really kind of curious moments in the text. This love, this identity she has with Heathcliff, and yet she does marry Edgar. And she says, I have no more business to marry Edgar Linton than I have to be in heaven. And if the wicked man in there had not brought Heathcliff so low, I shouldn't have thought of it. Nelly, I see now you think me a selfish wretch, but did it never strike you that if Heathcliff and I married, we should be beggars? Whereas if I marry Linton, I can aid Heathcliff to rise and place him out of my brother's power. So you've got this amazing conflict here between the kind of what we might broadly say are the Gothic and realist modes here that mirror Cathy's conflict. The romantic option, the windswept, passionate option would be to marry Heathcliff. But the cold, hard economic reality is marry Edgar and be economically comfortable and perhaps be able to offer economic help to Heathcliff. It's extraordinary, but that's what she does. Now, there's the question, which I'm not going to answer now. We can talk about this in workshops and seminars. Is she morally bankrupt for doing this? And some critics thought so. Or is she just responding to unreasonable patriarchal expectations? And that's a question which we can endeavour to answer together. So, thinking about the gender politics again in relation to the form of the novel, we have a series of narrators here, and this is again something we might attribute partly to the Gothic mode. the complexity of the textuality. Lockwood and Nellie. Nellie is the kind of main narrator. Is she reliable? Is she, as the critic James Hafley says, the chief villain because of the situations that she orchestrates quite deliberately or allows to happen as part of her narration? Good example here in Volume 1, Chapter 9, page 71. Ere this speech had ended, I became sensible of Heathcliff's presence. He had listened till he heard Catherine say it would degrade her to marry him, and then he stayed to hear no farther. But she knows Heathcliff's there listening, and she lets Cathy continue. Why? Is she just trolling, just stirring things up? Very curious behaviour, again, and we might see it as very unpleasant behaviour. Gilbert and Gubar, famously wrote The Madwoman in the Attic, see Nellie as a tool of patriarchy. She is acting out patriarchy's concerns, power dynamics, its wishes. She says, my heart invariably cleaved to the master's, that's Edgar's, in preference to Catherine's side. With reason, I imagine, for he was kind and trustful and honourable, etc. She's the opposite of that. So, yeah, there might be some evidence that that's where Nellie positions herself. She's on the side of the men in positions of familial and social power. So, like I said, tentative. And the main conclusion is that the novel is inconclusive, which you may not be terribly impressed by, but that's where we're at. The form of the novel is crucial here. It's multiple, unreliable narrators. So trying to get a firm, objective perspective on this is basically a hiding to nothing. It's not going to happen. So it is a novel which, on repeated readings, continues to baffle, continues to intrigue, because these different perspectives are played off against each other with no firm conclusions. The complex form, I would suggest, reflects the complex social, moral, economic questions and the perspectives, and all of those contexts that I've mentioned: evolutionary theory, the women's movement, the emerging romantic movement, the questioning of economic progress, the questioning of imperial endeavour. All of those things are bound up, I think, in the complex form here. You cannot have a simple narrative form for a novel emerging from such complex circumstances, we might suggest. There is a blending of genres here as well. We have a domestic drama, we have a romance, we have the Gothic mode, we have, in some ways, coming of age elements, Bildungsroman, with the emergence of the next generation, the coming of age of Heathcliff. So lots of different genres and modes are blended here as well. And again, all of this is about that central idea of this lecture, and I think a central way of understanding Wuthering Heights as transgressive, setting up boundaries which are consistently blurred or broken. A good novel stages debates. It dramatizes different viewpoints. It is polyphonic, multivocal, and doesn't provide simple answers. That's one of the strengths of the novel. We might say that none is more debate-oriented than Wuthering Heights. Again, I will leave that to you guys to discuss further in workshops and seminars. But certainly it's a novel, I think, which strenuously avoids simple answers to any of its questions. So there are references that I've mentioned. Gilbert and Gubar, The Madwoman in the Attic. James Hafley is the villain in Wuthering Heights. That's where he argues that Nellie is actually the villain. So there'll be useful things if you're interested in writing on this novel. And then, of course, primary text, as well as James Kavanagh's book on Emily Bronte from 1985. So thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoy reading Wuthering Heights, and I hope you enjoy talking about Wuthering Heights in the seminars. I'm very much looking forward to those discussions. And I hope you can help me get my head around a novel which, even having read it many times over the years, still, I'm almost proud to say, confuses me. So thanks very much.